Hey everyone and welcome to Storytime. My name is Jake and today we are going to be looking at the subreddit r/prorevenge. So sit back, relax and enjoy some Reddit stories. Racist boss harassed Puerto Rican employees and broke labor laws. Ended up getting deported. I worked at a fairly well-known restaurant in a small northern New England city as an assistant manager. The owners were very successful restaurateurs with several successful, non-chain establishments, and spent maybe a day or two a month in our location. The rest of the time there was a general manager in charge. We'll call her Jan. Jan was about as type A as they come. She was a middle-aged woman, but beautiful and petite, and she always looked put together and primped. Jan had started with the owners a decade earlier in their first restaurant as a server, and had worked her way up to general manager over the years. At first, I just thought she had extremely high standards, which I respected. I have high standards as well and take pride in my work. I had been impressed by how the kitchens were spotless, the staff was immaculate, like run a white gloved hand under the back of the oven and it comes back white kind of clean, and the food was always top quality. I had frequently been a customer and was thrilled that I got the job there. I had been in the business for a decade and that restaurant was the place in our area. I was so excited. Unfortunately, I quickly learned why everything is so shining and perfect. Jan was a tyrant. She was the kind of boss who soured the mood of the entire staff like a storm cloud hovering over us that never went away. Nothing was ever good enough, and the standards changed from day to day. On a good day, she would shut herself up in the office and then leave early. Good days were very rare and could turn into bad days at the drop of a dime. On bad days, you couldn't be perfect enough, and she would come up with new rules and regulations just to punish people. If a host called out sick, they were literal children, she would berate them on the phone and make them cry. If a cook made a mistake on a plate, she would humiliate them in front of the staff, accuse them of doing it on purpose, and then give us all the silent treatment for hours after. Seriously. If someone's cash out was off, even by a few cents, she would accuse them of theft and force me to cut down their hours. As a fellow manager, I was mostly spared her awful behavior, though I had to hear about her treatment from my staff almost every day. All of this was just run-of-the-mill bad boss stuff until it came for our yearly staff evaluation meetings. This is where Raul enters the story. Raul was a hard-working dishwasher who had moved to our state from Puerto Rico a few years earlier, and spoke English with some difficulty. Whenever I had to go over anything official with him, we would have a co-worker translate between us to be sure we're both communicating clearly. Jan refused this courtesy to Raul. This made his evaluation pretty difficult. Raul managed to communicate to us that due to recent cuts in his hours, he would be forced to get a second job to pay the bills. Something about this absolutely set Jan off. She told him she would fire him if he dared. I could see plainly on the intake paperwork in front of me that Raul had been hired with the understanding that it would be a full-time position, so I pointed that out. Jan was furious, but agreed through gritted teeth that if Raul agreed not to get a second job, she would bump his hours up to at least 35 hours a week. It was stated clear as day and I documented it in my daily manager logbook. Work went on as usual after that, and I didn't think much of this meeting again for a few months. Another time a while later, while filing out information for tax returns, Jan called me into the office. I could tell she had pulled the tiny room apart looking for something. "All the information about our Puerto Rican employees is gone," she told me with a mixture of panic and suspicion. I looked at the files in question and they all seemed to be in order, so I was confused and told her I couldn't help. A few minutes later, I walked back into the office to find her arguing with Rosa, our most talented chef and a Puerto Rican native. Rosa was perfectly fluent in English. "No, Rosa." Jan was speaking to Rosa as if she was hard of hearing or mentally slow. "Where is your green card?" "What are you talking about?" Rosa was confused. "Are you an illegal or something? Is that why one of you broke in here? To hide the proof?" Jan wasn't yelling, but her eyes were cold and flashing with rage. "What?" Rosa was starting to get angry now. It suddenly clicked for me, so I interrupted. "Jan, you do realize that Puerto Rico is a United States territory, right?" "Of course I know that," Jan snapped back. "Okay, so you know that Rosa has a social security number like any other American native." "Oh, right. Never mind, Rosa, you can go back to work." Jan did not apologize for accusing Rosa of theft. I was so done with this place after that. Jan did all kinds of little things like that, and she never apologized. I had already gotten a job offer for a place closer to my house when the final straw came. I was the closing manager one day and got in just before the dinner rush to see Raul storming out the back door. He didn't speak much English, but his cursing against Jan was very clear. Jan had lied about raising his hours to 35 per week, so Raul had gotten the second job he talked about. When Jan found out, she fired him, but not before saying something about how all you illegals are the same. She was really fixated on these American citizens being illegal aliens for some reason. By this point, I hated this woman too. She once told me my clothing made me look poor in front of the whole staff. I was wearing what she made me wear. Meanwhile, she wore open-toed shoes behind the line, which is against the health codes. And once her fake nail fell off into the coleslaw, and she wouldn't let anyone toss it out after she retrieved it. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but I have a life to live. Since I knew I would be leaving soon anyway, I told Raul he should go after our boss for wrongful termination, since I had documented proof with Jan's signature, that he had been promised more hours and that Jan had broken the agreement, not Raul. The last time I saw Jan was on my way out of Raul's lawyer's office, after giving a deposition about several labor laws she had violated, at least the ones that I knew about. Apparently, there were many others she had broken in front of the other employees. She couldn't even look me in the eye. The best part? At my deposition, I learned that Jan was actually the one who was illegally in the country. Her green card had recently expired. She was Canadian. She ended up being sent back to Canada as a result of this case, and no one has heard from her since. Raul was granted 6 months of unemployment pay, plus the restaurant had to pay his legal fees. They closed that location not long after. Maybe they should hire their managers more carefully next time. Jan, if you're reading this, I hope you get your stuff together. I also hope you learn to wear closed-toe shoes behind the line. You wouldn't want to end up a huge, gigantic mess-up due to your own negligence now, would you? That's like the stupidest thing I've ever heard. She's literally complaining about illegal immigrants and she's an immigrant. What? Put deployed maintainers in a lose-lose? Now you lose. This happened a few years back while I was active duty as an aircraft maintenance. Our rotating shifts were about 40 people. To get our aircraft, it was about a 20-minute drive to pass 2 checkpoints and get on a flight line, and it was not possible to walk through. Checkpoints and flight line were non-walkable. Now, when a unit deploys, you get a grab bag officer and senior leadership. This is either really good or really bad. This trip was really bad. We had an officer that was desperately looking for promotion and a senior that cared only about himself and making his leadership happy. His job is usually to take care of his troops under him. We had 7 trucks to take us out of the aircraft, and all of them were worn thin. They'd been in a desert environment and worked hard their whole life, and many had duct tape handles, spliced wires, torn up walls, you name it. On top of that, the sand had permanently stained them into an ugly light brown color. When they wouldn't run, we'd turn them in to be fixed, but everything else we'd make work to do the job. One day, the officer's boss dropped in to visit the peons. He was bothered by the ugly color of the vehicles and disgusted by the cosmetic look of the interiors. After talking to the maintainers, he settled down and understood the situation. The officer and senior were with him during the walkthrough and heard his complaints and saw him relax and understand. Once he left, we were all called into a meeting. Our leadership demanded we turn in our vehicles for any damage at all that they had, even scratches, and that he would personally give us paperwork for any section that had a damaged or dirty vehicle. He wouldn't listen to reason, as even our QA guys were fine with the vehicles and we had no liability. Burned, ignored, and chastised, we walked out to get in the vehicles and catch the aircraft that was landing in 30 minutes. Senior followed us out with paper towels and cleaning products and demanded we make the vehicles white before we left. We couldn't convince him otherwise, and catching the jet was more important, so everybody frantically tried scrubbing at the trucks. Nothing was changing. They truly were permanently stained. Time was short. We had to leave that second. Senior started screaming at one of the maintainers and grabbed a rag and cleaner and stood on his truck trying to scrub it as we were rushing to get out of the line. The truck stayed and we had enough people to barely make it out and catch and bed down the aircraft. While out on the line, we all got together and wrote down every single scratch and issue on the remaining 6 vehicles. I'm talking discolorations, scratches, smells, everything. Each vehicle had a laundry list of 80 plus items. Our vehicle maintenance would take a week and a half to get a vehicle back to us for an oil change. We knew we wouldn't see these again for 6 months. Some items would make the vehicle unusable, such as broken windows that wouldn't close and broken AC that we simply dealt with to meet the mission. This means vehicle maintenance would not be able to release/return them once turned in until they were fixed. Returning from the line, we dropped all 6 vehicles off at vehicle maintenance and walked back to our unit. Sitting in the parking lot in a screaming match with the maintainer in the only remaining vehicle was our senior, still holding a rag. He'd been yelling and scrubbing for hours. We told him we turned all the vehicles in and needed to turn that last one in. We also let him know we were told not to expect the vehicles back for a few months due to the extensive work on them and the low priority on cosmetic damage. He nearly had a stroke, his face turned red, and he ran inside to the officer. As we were finishing up the list of damages on the last vehicle, our officer and senior walked out, senior looking like a beaten dog. The officer apologized for the short-sighted threats and said he had tried to get the vehicles back, but they could only release 3. The officer and senior had their own personal vehicles to get to work and could be driven on the flight line. They had no choice but to give us the keys so we could get our guys to and from work and out to the aircraft. For the remainder of the deployment, officer and senior had to use the base buses and walk nearly a mile in the desert heat to get to work, as their schedule was skewed 2 hours from ours. I assume they didn't pursue another vehicle, as they didn't want to look bad to the big boss who was fine with the cosmetic damage. The maintainers took turns driving the nice cars leadership gave us, and seeing the senior show up half an hour late covered in sweat always raised morale. That's some good malicious compliance there. Hey everyone, I hope you all had a really good day and that you enjoyed that video. If you want to check out some other videos, then click on screen right now or check out the playlist down below. If you enjoyed that video, then please do leave a like. And if you want to submit your own stories, then you can do so by joining the Discord in the top link in the description. But thank you so much for watching and I will see you very soon.